Before Europe ruled the world, it had a problem. It wanted the wealth of Asia. Silk, porcelain, cotton, tea, spices, but Asia did not need much from Europe in return. Europe wanted to buy, but it could not easily sell, so Europe needed a way in, and the price of entry was silver. The familiar story begins in Europe. Europe discovers, Europe innovates, Europe conquers, Europe becomes modern. It is a powerful story. It is simple, it is easy to remember, but it leaves something important outside the frame. The world economy did not begin when Europe arrived, it was already moving. Many histories begin around the year 1500. That starting point is convenient. It makes Europe look like the center of everything. The ships leave from Europe. The maps are drawn in Europe. The empires carry European names. But 1500 was not the birth of the world economy. It was a turning point inside a much older system. Long before European dominance, trade routes already connected the old world. Caravans crossed Central Asia. Merchants sailed the Indian Ocean. Ports linked China, India, Arabia, Persia, Southeast Asia, and East Africa. This was not modern globalization, but it was already a world of exchange. Goods moved, money moved, knowledge moved. For centuries, Asia was the great center of population, production, and demand. China was a vast market. India produced textiles desired across continents. Southeast Asian ports moved spices, ceramics, timber, and luxury goods. Europe was not irrelevant, but it was not yet the commanding center. The economic gravity of the world pulled east. Europe wanted Asian goods, but Asian markets did not want enough European goods in return. This created a simple problem, and a very powerful one Europe could buy, but it could not easily sell. To enter the Asian economy, Europe needed something more acceptable than its own products. It needed money the world trusted. Europe's trade with Asia was structurally unbalanced. Asian goods flowed west. European silver flowed east. This was not a small detail. It was the hidden mechanism behind early global trade. Europe's rise did not begin with total dominance. It began with dependency. Europe had to pay its way into the system. The key was silver. Silver could cross borders. It could be weighed. It could be tested. It could be melted. It could be recoined. It was trusted by merchants who did not share a language or a ruler or a religion. Before the dollar became global money, silver connected the early modern world. The rise of Europe was not inevitable. History did not move in a straight line. Not from Renaissance to empire to industry, global power. It moved through accidents, shortages, discoveries, trade imbalances, and violent systems of extraction. The modern world was not built by one civilization alone. It was built by systems. Behind the familiar story was a hidden system. Asian demand, American silver, European ships, African enslavement, indigenous forced labor, Chinese taxes, global trade routes. This was not one story. It was a machine. Money moved across oceans, and wherever money moved, power began to follow. So the real question is not simply this: why did Europe rise? The better question is this: why did Europe rise so late, after centuries in which Asia had been richer, larger, and more productive? To answer that, we have to stop looking only at European ships. We have to follow the silver. Before the West became the center of the modern world, the world had other centers, other routes, other markets, other forms of power. This is not a story about Europe discovering an empty world. It is a story about Europe entering a world already in motion, a world with its own gravity, and that gravity pulled toward Asia. Imagine the map differently. Do not place Europe at the center. Place the Indian Ocean at the center. Place China, India, Southeast Asia, and the Islamic world at the center. From this angle, Europe looks different, less like the origin of the system, more like one edge of it. The old trade circuits were deep, and they were resilient. Silk moved overland, spices moved by sea, porcelain traveled through ports and merchant houses, credit moved with goods, trust moved with reputation, commercial knowledge moved from port to port. No single empire controlled the entire network, but many societies depended on it. Asia produced goods the world wanted. Chinese porcelain was not just decoration. Indian cotton was not just fabric. These were advanced manufactured goods. They represented skill, labor, technology, and market power. Europe did not simply admire Asian goods. Europe depended on access to them. China became one of the great demand centers of the early modern world. It sold goods that foreign merchants wanted, and it absorbed enormous quantities of silver. This made China more than a destination. It became a monetary force, a market powerful enough to pull metal across oceans. The world's silver began to flow east. Around 1750, Asia contained most of the world's people. It also produced a major share of global output. This matters because scale creates gravity. Large populations create demand. Demand creates markets. Markets attract money. And in this period, much of that money moved toward Asia. Europe was dynamic. Its states competed fiercely. Its merchants were ambitious. Its ships became increasingly powerful, but dynamic did not mean dominant. Europe was active, but it was still trying to solve the same problem. How do you pay for Asian goods? How do you enter a market that does not need enough from you? European goods often struggled in Asian markets. There were exceptions. But structurally, Europe lacked enough desirable exports to balance the flow. Asian consumers did not need Europe in the same way Europe needed Asia. This imbalance mattered. It forced Europe to search for a universal payment, a payment that Asian markets would accept. Silver opened the door. It gave European merchants access to markets they could not otherwise balance. It allowed them to buy silk, porcelain, cotton, tea, and spices. Europe did not first enter Asia as the workshop of the world. It entered as a buyer with silver in hand. European companies learned to operate inside Asian trade. The Dutch and English East India companies did not only ship goods back to Europe. They traded between Asian ports. They moved goods through existing networks. They became brokers, carriers, financiers, and military merchants. They learned the system before they reshaped it. The early global economy was not controlled by one power. It was a web: states, merchants, ports, seas, violence, and trust. Some routes were old, some were new, some were peaceful, some were brutal. But the system was larger than any single empire. The Portuguese sea route to India changed Europe's access to Asia, but it did not make Europe the center overnight. It gave European merchants a sea path into a world that already had rules, prices, powerful ports, and powerful participants. The route mattered, but the market was not waiting to be invented. Spain's answer came from the Americas. The conquest of American lands brought access to silver on a scale Europe had never known. This changed everything, not because silver stayed in Spain, but because silver gave Spain, and eventually Europe, a way to pay into Asia. The Americas became Europe's payment source. The incorporation of the Americas made the Old World economy planetary. The Atlantic and Pacific became connected. Mines, ports, ships, tax systems, merchant networks. They formed new circuits across oceans. The world was not simply becoming larger, it was becoming more financially connected. Spanish silver became one of the first truly global forms of money. It moved across empires. It entered Asian markets. It appeared in ports far from the mines where it began. A silver coin could cross oceans more easily than trust. That was its power. It made strangers willing to trade. The hidden engine was simple: demand in Asia, extraction in America, transport through empire, labor coerced across continents. Silver was the bloodstream. It connected regions that had never before been locked so tightly into the same economic circuit. The machine was global, but its costs were uneven. To understand the first global economy, do not begin with flags, begin with flows. Where did the metal come from? Who mined it? Who moved it? Who accepted it? And where did it finally go? Follow the silver, and the map of power begins to change. Inside China, the story begins with money. Paper currency had once been an extraordinary innovation, but paper depends on trust. When confidence weakens, paper can lose its power. As Ming paper money declined, silver became more important in markets, in taxes, and in the daily life of exchange. Silver became deeply tied to taxation and markets. This was not just a preference for metal, it became structural demand. If taxes had to be paid in silver, people needed silver. If millions of people needed silver, the economy pulled more bullion into circulation. A domestic money problem became a global signal. The single whip reforms helped convert many tax obligations into silver payments. A domestic fiscal reform became a global force. Because once the state demanded silver, silver became more than money. It became a requirement for survival inside the tax system. China's demand reached across the world, and the world responded. Silver was not valued the same everywhere. In China, silver could be worth more relative to gold than it was in Europe or in Spanish America. This difference created opportunity. A trader could move silver from where it was cheaper to where it was more valuable. Profit lived in the gap. This was the logic of arbitrage. Buy low in one world, sell high in another, but the reality was never clean. Ships sank, pirates attacked, states taxed, wars interrupted routes. Some historians debate how large these profits really were, but the pull of silver toward China was real. Then came Potosi, a mountain in the Andes, became one of the great silver engines of world history. Its wealth helped feed global trade, but the mountain was not simply a source of treasure. It was a machine of extraction, and that machine consumed human lives. In 1545, rich silver deposits were discovered at Potosi. From that moment, the scale of silver production changed. The Spanish Empire gained access to a monetary resource that could reach across the planet. But extraction was not automatic. It required labor, coercion, technology, and violence. The silver system had a human cost. Indigenous communities were forced into mining labor. Men worked in dangerous tunnels, mercury refining damaged bodies and landscapes. The silver that entered global trade did not come from nowhere. It came from people pushed into the earth. The coin carried suffering inside it. Potosi was not alone. Mexico also became a major source of silver. Together, American mines transformed the supply of global bullion. The Americas became liquidity for the old world economy, and Europe became the carrier of metal that Asian markets were ready to absorb. The system grew larger and darker. Japan also played a major role. In the late 16th century, Japanese mines supplied large quantities of silver to East Asian trade. This reminds us that the system was not only Atlantic, it was also Asian. Silver moved through multiple routes. China's demand drew from every available source. Manila became the bridge. Spanish silver from the Americas crossed the Pacific. Chinese merchants brought silk, porcelain, and other goods. The exchange happened in a colonial port, but the demand came from Asia. Manila turned the Pacific into a commercial corridor. A new oceanic system was born. The Pacific route depended on wind and navigation. The return voyage from Asia to the Americas made regular trade possible. Without that route, the Manila Galleon system could not function. Geography became infrastructure. Wind became a trading system. The ocean became a bridge, and silver began to cross it. The Manila Galleon carried silver west, and Asian goods east. For centuries, this route linked Acapulco and Manila. It connected American mines to Chinese merchants. It was dangerous, slow, and costly. But it completed something extraordinary: a permanent trans-Pacific trade circuit. Chinese merchants made the system work. They brought goods into Manila. They tested silver. They negotiated prices. They connected colonial trade to Chinese markets. Without these intermediaries, silver would not have moved so efficiently into Asia. Empires made routes, but merchants made them function. The Atlantic was the other side of the circuit. Silver moved from American mines to Spain. From Spain, it entered European finance, war, debt, and trade. Some stayed in Europe. But much of Europe's silver eventually moved onward. Toward the Asian goods Europe could not stop buying. By the late 16th century, the system had become global. The Americas supplied silver. Africa supplied coerced labor to colonial economies. Europe moved goods, metal, and violence. Asia absorbed silver and exported manufactures. The world was no longer separate regions. It was one connected machine. Europe's strategy was to become the broker, not simply to produce better goods, not yet, but to control routes, ships, ports, and payments. The great European trading companies learned to profit from movement. They inserted themselves between producers, buyers, and empires, but every system creates pressure. Silver brought wealth. It also brought inflation. It connected markets. It also transmitted crisis. It empowered empires. It also exposed their weaknesses. The same metal that opened doors could destabilize the world behind them. European commercial empires benefited. Silver gave them access. Access created profit. Profit financed ships, companies, armies, and states. The Dutch and English learned how to turn trade into power. They did not begin as masters of the system, but they became increasingly skilled at using it. China also benefited. Its goods were in demand. Its merchants received silver. Its economy became deeply commercialized in many regions. For a long time, China sold what the world wanted, and the world paid in metal. But dependence on silver also created vulnerability. Strength and risk grew together. Spain controlled the greatest silver flows, but silver did not make Spain the leading industrial power. This is one of history's great ironies. The empire with the silver suffered inflation, debt, military overreach, and repeated fiscal crisis. Wealth can strengthen a state, but it can also weaken it. The inflow of silver contributed to rising prices in Europe. More money entered circulation, prices climbed, wages struggled, states borrowed, wars became more expensive. Silver was not only a tool of trade, it changed the internal balance of European societies. Money moved, and society shifted. The greatest cost was paid far from the counting houses: indigenous miners, enslaved Africans, colonial laborers, communities forced into systems they did not design. The silver economy was not a clean story of global trade. It was built on coercion. Every route had a human shadow. In the Andes, the meter labor system supplied workers to the mines. Potosi became wealthy because labor was forced into danger. The mountain was not only a symbol of abundance, it was a symbol of extraction. The world received silver. The miners received shortened lives. That was the hidden bargain. Across the Atlantic world, enslaved Africans were forced into plantation and extraction economies. These economies sustained European colonial wealth. The silver system cannot be separated from this broader world of forced labor. Money moved through markets, but the labor behind it was often unfree. The system was global, so was the suffering. The movement of goods was not only about silver crops, also crossed oceans. Maize and sweet potatoes entered China. They helped support population growth. The early global economy moved metals, plants, people, and diseases. Every connection changed the conditions of life somewhere else. The benefits and costs of the system were not evenly shared. Profits accumulated in ports, companies, and imperial treasuries. Pain accumulated in mines, plantations, and colonized communities. This is the hidden moral structure of early globalization. The map of trade was also a map of suffering. In the 17th century, the machine began to stutter. Silver flows became less reliable. Mines faced pressure. Japan restricted foreign trade. The price gap narrowed. States across the world faced fiscal stress. The 1640s became an age of crisis in many regions at once. As gold and silver ratios converged, easy profits faded. The arbitrage engine weakened. Moving silver across the world was still useful, but it was no longer the same extraordinary opportunity. When the gap closed, one of the system's hidden sources of energy began to decline. Mines could not expand forever. Deeper extraction required more labor, more technology, and more cost. The silver supply that had once seemed limitless became harder to sustain. A global system built on metal flows became vulnerable to changes underground. The mountain had limits, so did the system. The Ming dynasty collapsed in the 1640s. Silver did not single-handedly cause that collapse. History is never that simple. But silver shortages and fiscal stress became part of a wider crisis. When a state's tax system depends on a global flow, disruption can become dangerous. Money stress can become state stress. Historians disagree on how central silver was. Some emphasize arbitrage, some emphasize Chinese demand, some emphasize European institutions, science, or military power. Others focus on coal, colonies, and ecology. The point is not to replace one simple myth with another. The point is to see the system clearly. What we can say is this: silver connected distant regions into one fragile structure. It made trade easier. It made empires richer. It made societies more dependent. Connection created opportunity, but connection also created vulnerability. The same routes that carried wealth could also carry crisis. Around 1750, the pattern began to change. Asia remained powerful, but parts of Asia faced demographic and ecological pressure. Europe, especially Britain, found new ways to escape local limits. The next stage of world history would not be driven by silver alone. It would be driven by energy. The West rose late. That is the first thing to remember. European dominance was not the permanent condition of world history. It was a recent development. For much longer, Asia had been central to production, population, and demand. The modern world did not begin with Western supremacy. That supremacy came later. Parts of Asia faced growing constraints. Population increased, land became more pressured, fuel and resources became harder to secure. Commercial growth created new dependencies. These were not signs of backwardness. They were signs of a successful economy pressing against ecological limits. Growth created pressure. Britain had two unusual advantages: coal below the ground, colonies across the sea. Coal offered concentrated energy. Colonies offered land, raw materials, labor systems, and markets. Together, they helped Europe escape limits that other regions could not escape in the same way. Industrialization was not only about invention, it was about energy. Coal allowed production to expand beyond the limits of wood muscle, wind, and water. Factories were not just machines, they were new ways of concentrating power through fossil energy. This changed the scale of history. Colonies expanded Europe's ecological map. Land overseas produced sugar, cotton, timber, food, and raw materials. Imperial systems moved resources toward European centers. Industrial growth did not happen inside Europe alone. It depended on a world outside Europe. And that outside world paid part of the cost. Trade became capital. Capital financed ships. Ships protected routes. Routes created profits. Profits built institutions. Institutions financed more trade and war. The silver system did not create industrial capitalism by itself, but it helped build the commercial world in which capitalism could expand. One system prepared the ground for another. There was no single cause of the great divergence. Not silver alone, not coal alone, not science alone, not empire alone. The rise of the West came from alignment, energy, colonies, capital, violence, institutions, and timing. History was not destiny, it was convergence. André Gunder Frank argued that the world economy had long been Asia-centered. In his view, Europe's rise was late, contingent, and connected to Asian decline. This reversal is powerful. It forces us to stop asking why Europe was always superior and start asking how global systems shifted. But the reversal can go too far. Europe did develop important institutions, technologies, military systems, and scientific cultures. Those things mattered. The point is not to erase European agency. The point is to place it inside a larger system. Europe rose through internal change and external advantage. The better question is not this: why was Europe superior? The better question is this: what conditions made European dominance possible at that moment? That question changes everything. It turns history from a story of destiny into a story of systems, and systems can shift. Today, Asia is again central to manufacturing, trade, finance, and geopolitical imagination. Some call this the rise of Asia, but from a longer view, it may look more like a return. For much of history, Asia was not the edge of the world economy. It was one of its great centers. Silver reveals that money is never just money. It is a map of trust, a tool of taxation, a bridge between markets, a reason for conquest, a symbol of dependency, and sometimes a quiet force that moves power before anyone names it. Money does not only measure value, it organizes power. Europe did not simply discover the world. It entered a world already moving, and to enter it, Europe paid in silver. The world before the West was not simple. The world after the West will not be simple either. But if we want to understand power, we must learn to see the systems beneath the story, because history is not only made by kings, wars, and inventions, it is also made by the quiet movement of money.